Welcome to the CHCH Newsmakers podcast. I'm your host, Rick Zamperin. If it's making news in Hamilton, Halton, and Niagara, across Canada or around the world, rest assured I'll tackle it here on Newsmakers. Remembrance Day is 1 week from today, and we will gather once again to honor those who made the ultimate sacrifice to preserve the freedom that we continue to enjoy today. When it comes to the Canadian Armed Forces, Hamilton has a rich history, and here to tell us about it is retired Captain Tim Fletcher. Captain Fletcher, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting.
I want to begin with your career in the Canadian Armed Forces, an illustrious 36-year and counting career in the Canadian Armed Forces. Where did it all begin and why?
Well, I used to be a radio reporter in St. Catharines at the now, well, I guess it's been rehabbed, CHSC Radio.
Right.
And I got invited to go on training exercise with the Lincoln Welland Regiment.
Okay.
And about a year later, they said, look, you've been hanging around. You either join or you can't come back.
It was as clear as that, eh?
Okay, I'll join.
Yeah.
So I joined. My dad was 20 years in the Air Force before he retired. So I joined. And after about 5 years, I was transferred, because I was a reporter, I was transferred to the headquarters here in Hamilton, Hamilton Militia District, now defunct, into the Public Affairs branch. And then Hamilton Militia District closed, and I was transferred to the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, and then from there transferred to 31 Brigade in London with the proviso I could remain part-time with the RHLI.
Okay.
And we never looked back from there until I finally retired in July 2012.
Mm-hmm. So your father was in the RCAF.
Yes.
Did he want you to go into the military?
He didn't know. He never pushed us one way or the other.
Okay.
But I got invited on this exercise. Seemed like a lot of fun. I wasn't subject to orders and discipline as a reporter, so I didn't realize. But anyway, once you join, then everything else kicks in.
Yeah.
But it continued being fun. It was adventurous. It was exciting. And I managed to get one United Nations short deployment in to Ukraine, providing an overview of NATO-style public affairs to the Ukrainian army. But that was only 2 days. And the rest of the time we were in Naples, Italy, and then back home again. So that was my main overseas adventure, but I've been to the States a few times, Fort Knox training and so on. But you meet the most diverse and incredible group of people over 36 years.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't trade any of it.
What are some of your early memories or accomplishments or maybe a unique story that still sticks with you to this day?
Well, where to start?
Yeah, you have an encyclopedia.
Where to start? Well, when I was still an infantry officer with the Lincoln and Welland, we went on an exercise to the training grounds near Meaford, Ontario. And it's very developed there now on the base, but it was very undeveloped at that time. We were living in tents in the wood. It was February. Fairly cold. I was told to lead a patrol, go to point from A to B, come back again. So we started doing that. We were on our snowshoes, but it was kind of boring. So I thought I would stage a little ambush. So I sent some soldiers ahead to set up an ambush, and then the main body would go down and find them, and we'd have our little firefight. So that's what happened. We went down, we found them, we had a little firefight, and we came back. And my commander said, "What was that all about?" "Well, we had this little..." "You weren't supposed to. That's all our ammunition."
Oh, no.
So the rest of the weekend, we had to go bang, bang instead of shoot, shoot. So, well, you survive these little things, but, things that you learn as you go.
Yeah.
So there were many other things. I've had the opportunity to meet royalty and national, provincial leaders through wearing the uniform with saluting and all that stuff. Most citizens never get a chance to encounter things on that scale and that grandeur. And it is grand to do that. To take part in something in your community or beyond, in uniform, representing your country, to me, is one of the highest honors I've ever had.
Well, 36 years, by the way, thank you for your service. Did it go by like that?
When you're in, you say, when you're up to your neck in water in a trench in Meaford, and it's pouring rain and it's cold and the mud is literally a foot thick, your boots are coated, your sleeping bag's soaked, you're soaked, you're miserable, you're tired, you haven't slept for 2 days, you think, will this never end? And then one day you wake up and you say, my God, this is my last day. What am I going to do? When at that time, there was a mandatory retirement age of 55, but you could get extended to 60. So they extended me to age 60. But then the day comes, and all of a sudden, on a Tuesday night, you're saying, I should be going to the armories, but I can't do that anymore. And so there's a void when you first retire. So I had many other things to do, and I stayed affiliated with my regiment, helped them write this history book, and so on. So it wasn't a totally abrupt transition, but all of a sudden I'm not wearing the uniform. I'm not taking part inside the parades or inside the training. If I'm there, I'm on the outside looking in all of a sudden. So it's a huge void when you step away after that long on the inside.
What was it like waking up the next morning knowing that you wouldn't be able to do this anymore?
It was weird. It was very strange because when I joined, every piece of kit I was issued did not even fill one kit bag. Maybe half filled it. When I retired, I turned in almost 3 kit bags worth of gear. So I didn't so much lose an Army career as I gained a closet.
That's a good way to put it.
But it was strange because all of a sudden I go to my closet and this stuff is not hanging in there anymore.
Yeah.
And I have no right anymore to put on this uniform that I wore for 36 years. So it was very strange.
As you're standing in this ditch during a training exercise, correct? Did it also put into perspective what the soldiers in the Second World War, in the First World War, in Korea, and in Afghanistan, did it put in perspective how they dealt with similar situations?
Well, we have a saying in the Army, it doesn't matter what you're into, you just keep on keeping on. And you struggle through it while you're there. And you do develop a kinship. Many of our World War II veterans I knew personally, most are gone now. And you talk about their trials and tribulations, struggling through snow, struggling through deep mud, chest deep in water, holding their rifles over their heads. And you can empathize with all that. The only difference, of course, is no one was shooting at me with live ammunition.
Right.
But the physical struggles of simply surviving, even without the added pressure of being shot at, you do appreciate that.
Now, you're officially retired, but you're still serving in some capacity with the RHLI.
The RHLI, in common with many reserve units, has a regimental senate, which is composed of retired soldiers and community leaders who form an advisory and support body for the regiment. And they asked me to join that after I retired, which I did. One of the things I did as a side duty with the RHLI was produce all their special event programs for dinners, for parades, for civic things. And so I kept on doing that. And as a result, I've been fortunate to keep my hand in with the daily life and rhythm of the regiment. And so the transition hasn't been too bad, although my wife says I should be paid for this still, but
Yes.
But it keeps me busy and keeps me engaged.
Absolutely. As I mentioned off the top, Hamilton has a rich history when it comes to the Canadian military. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, one of the units to lead the way. How did this all form?
Before 1860 or 1862, that era, the military in Hamilton was a hodgepodge of independent small units, often formed at the whim of somebody who wanted to feel self-important or felt a sense of duty and wanted to form a military unit. And at that time, we also still had British soldiers in garrison in Hamilton.
This is before Confederation.
Before Confederation. So in 1862, Isaac Buchanan convinced the government to authorize the amalgamation of many of these independent companies, as they were called, into one regiment, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, as it is now. Back then, it was the 13th Regiment of Militia brackets Infantry. So that was formed in 1862 and brought some sense of order to the Hamilton military community and amalgamated a lot of loose structures into a more formal, a more disciplined structure. They began training. They raised their own money to build the first armory downtown,
really?
Where the current armory is. It was built at a cost of $4,000.
Wow.
And
which was a lot of money back then.
A lot of money back then. It was a wood frame structure. And from that structure, in 1866, they marched off to war for the first time in our own backyard in Ridgeway, Ontario, when the Fenians came across the border. The Fenians were Irish Americans who wanted to cause havoc here to put pressure on Britain to free Ireland across the ocean. So they came across and moved as far as Ridgeway, Port Colborne, and into that area. And the Canadian government mobilized. They sent the Queen's Own Rifles from Toronto across the lake by ferry, and they met up at the 13th Regiment and took the train on a circuitous route through Port Colborne to Ridgeway, where they got off and marched to the sound of the guns, as they say. The battle was disastrous, to say the least. At first it went well, but the Fenians were mostly Civil War veterans, very well trained, very well disciplined. Although, as it turns out, many of them were, shall we say, impaired at the time.
Okay.
But they knew how to fight.
Yeah.
So they led the Canadian forces into kind of a trap and then opened fire. And the inexperienced militia, many of whom had actually never even loaded their weapons prior to this, because training was very basic in those days, they broke and ran. And people are saying, well, they broke and ran, it was a defeat. But the Fenians never advanced another foot. They realized the people of Canada did not support them, and their cause was lost in Canada. They retreated. British forces were coming up the other way, almost as badly organized as the militia. And so the Fenians retreated back to Fort Erie, fought another pitched battle, and then retreated back across the river. That was the biggest Fenian raid. There were smaller ones just before and some after, but that was the highlight, and they never had a chance of success. So the Queen's Own Rifles and the 13th Regiment, with today's RHLI, fought the very first battle on Canadian soil, fought entirely by Canadian soldiers using more or less modern weapons. It was the very first, you might say, Canadian battle of independence.
Right.
And the Fenians retreated. So the battle tactically was a loss, but strategically a win, and set Canada onto its modern path. The politicians under Macdonald realized Canada had to get its act together. And what happened a year after that battle? Confederation.
Right. So did those battles with the Fenians kind of set the stage for the importance of the RHLI, that this unit was desperately needed?
It set the importance of Canada becoming responsible for its own defense.
Okay.
The British began withdrawing their soldiers from Canada. They were heavily involved in the Crimea and other places and needed their forces. And they were tired of paying for a military that they derived very little benefit from, at great expense to the British taxpayer. And they said, look, you've got to stand on your own 2 feet. And it took a very long time for that to happen. Canadian politicians, and I apologize if they're listening, have been very stingy in supporting the Canadian military. We're heroes in war and a burden in peace. Some ask for more than the government's prepared to give, as we've so famously heard. But we persevere. We last through trials and tribulations, successes and failures, because even with our reduced numbers, there are still tens and 20s and 30s of thousands of Canadians who have put on their uniform and are prepared to stand up for Canada. There's not many people that would do that.
Yeah. The RHLI motto, Semper Paratus?
Semper Paratus.
Semper Paratus, thanks for correcting me. Always ready.
Always ready.
And that is still the case.
It is still the case. In fact, they're training tonight for Remembrance Day. You'll see them down at the armories, uniforms on, lining up, marching in precision. We're welcoming our new honorary colonel this evening as well. And the honorary colonel is chair of the Senate and helps lead the regiment in the community. And then they'll be marching on Remembrance Day with the Argylls and all other HMCS Star and cadets, Hamilton Police marching. These are people who are prepared to stand up for this country, and I'm grateful that they do so in public where the people can see them.
Yes, very much so. The RHLI, according to my research, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and I might be, during the First World War, were in Britain, France, and Flanders, which is Belgium. Tactically sound? Do they make any, significant headway?
The RHLI, the 13th Battalion, no Canadian regiments went overseas in World War I under their own name. Colonel Sam Hughes, the Minister of Defense, scrapped the mobilization plan on the outbreak of war, created his own plan, and created a series of what we called numbered battalions, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to like 285.
Okay.
And these numbered battalions went overseas. Many were disbanded and amalgamated as replacements. The RHLI contributed to a number of these, notably the 4th Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force. And it is the 4th Battalion that provided most of the impetus, along with the 86th Machine Gun Battalion, the 205th Hamilton Tigers. They went over to the UK, got sorted out more, and then were sent over to France. The Mad 4th, at one of their historic battles, got their name the Mad 4th. Their Colonel Burchell, who was an expatriate British colonel, led them up this hill, and he was about 6 foot, and he stood out on the battlefield. And so a sniper shot him. And the battalion, who really liked this guy, went mad and took the objective in the face of withering German machine gun and artillery fire. And sustained 50% casualties, but they took the objective. So they became known as the Mad 4th and carried on. And Sergeant William Merrifield at Arras earned his Victoria Cross there, our first Victoria Cross. And it gives you some sense of the fighting. He charged 2 machine gun trenches on his own, killing and capturing the occupants.
Wow.
And that set the tone. World War I, though, was a learning experience. They went in haphazardly, poorly trained, relying on the regulars, of which there were not enough. And it very quickly devolved, in the face of modern weaponry, mainly machine guns and high-volume artillery, into a stalemate in the trenches. They then had to learn how to live and fight in that environment, sustaining huge, unimaginable numbers of casualties. The image of the soldiers coming out of the trenches, going over the top, with enemy machine guns firing 1,000 bullets a minute, and there were 1,000 machine guns, plus the artillery of all natures. They would tunnel underneath the trenches and set off huge underground explosions they called mines. Somehow they managed to live and fight in that environment until the final 100 days of the war, when the Allies, led by the Canadians, including the 4th Battalion, absorbed their lessons, created a tactical plan, General Currie, the Canadian leader, had a daring plan to funnel his troops across the Canal du Nord, across a narrow access point, led by tanks. The first really successful tank attack. Even though the tanks bogged down, they still were able to fire and support. And the Canadians broke through the German lines and just spread out like a flood, and began the last 100 days of the battle. So it was led by the Canadians, including the 4th Battalion. So the Canadians became known as shock troops, and that is what was expected of them going into World War II as well.
What made the Canadian soldiers so effective?
Well, that's a good question, but there was definitely a lot of national pride there. The maple leaf was not officially a Canadian symbol at that point, but when you go through the tunnels at Vimy, when you go through other places, you'll find the soldiers carving the maple leaf into the sides of their trenches, into the chalk, onto their little plaques, they used to take old ammunition shell casings and turn them into what we call trench art, and the maple leaf would be engraved and etched into those. So there was a huge national pride. The Canadians knew who they were, knew what they were fighting for. Most of them were citizen soldiers, and they just wanted to go home. But they couldn't go home till the war was over. So they did their very best to end the war. They were not what you'd call a phlegmatic or kind of laid back. They were there to do a job to the best of their ability. There was national pride, and they stood up and did not let obstacles defeat them. A lot of them were frontiers people, a lot of them were city people, but they stood up together. They were tough. They were better fed than many of their European counterparts. They were taller, they were bigger, they were stronger, and led by this pride, they just became very, very tough soldiers led by good leaders, and they prevailed and overcame.
To the Second World War, and there's many stories of Dieppe and the failure that it was, but the lessons that were learned through those 8 or 6 or however many hours it was for that, particular event to come to a close. How significant was that? How big of a failure was it, and how significant was this battle?
We don't call Dieppe a failure. Dieppe was a raid. They were going to go there, wreak havoc, and come home again.
Right. And
they did that. The outstanding feature of the raid, though, was the huge number of casualties.
Right.
Over 1,000 killed. Many, many more wounded and maimed. The Rileys themselves lost 197 killed, and nearly 300 into captivity, many of them wounded, and most of the survivors that came back were wounded. But a lot of people say they learned lessons for D-Day, and they did. They knew that they couldn't attack a fortified town. They had to come across beaches, and they had to develop the means to do that. The raid had to fail, if you want to use that term. Right. Churchill was under pressure from the Americans to mount an immediate cross-channel invasion, not a raid, the full invasion. The Russians were reeling on the Russian front, the Eastern Front. And Stalin was putting pressure. You've got to do something to get the German pressure off us.
Right.
But Churchill said, I am not sending 4 or 5 or 6 divisions to France to have them wiped out again. It's not going to happen. We can't do it. So he had to massage the British, appease the Russians, and Dieppe became the foil for that. They sent off a large-scale raid. The first one was canceled. And the principle is, you don't remount a canceled operation because soldiers go on leave, they go into pubs, they write letters home. But Mountbatten said, we're going to do it again. He was chief of combined operations, became later Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, of course. And so the raid had to prove that an invasion was not practical at that point. That unfortunately involved an awful lot of Canadian casualties. But it has to be said the Canadian leadership was advocating for this raid. They wanted Canadians to get into action, and the Canadian public wanted to get in on the action. Some of the soldiers wanted to get in on the action, not all. Nobody wants to go and voluntarily be shot at. So they went. 2nd Canadian Division went and was massacred. Strategically, it proved an invasion couldn't work. It made them hold off for 2 more years. And as we know, D-Day did work.
Right.
So in that respect, it was good for D-Day.
One of the names that came about from the Dieppe raid, or Operation Jubilee, was what it was called. RHLI Captain Dennis Whitaker was the only one to make it into town or make it to his objective. Do you know much about?
I know Denny well. I knew Denny well. We called him the General, of course, because after the war, he was promoted to Brigadier. Him and another captain, Tony Hill, and some soldiers were both able to break into town. Whitaker led his people ashore, and there was a large casino there, a very strong point made of poured concrete and stuff. And he thought, well, that seems like a good place to be. He led his soldiers there.
Yeah.
They broke into the casino. They cleared most of it. Some Germans still remained on the upper floor, but they cleared the lower. Now, this is their first foray in the battle. The Germans have been fortifying this town for 2 years.
Yeah, this is all foreign territory.
This is all foreign territory, and it's their first experience with warfare.
Wow.
Live ammunition, people shooting at them, people dying all around, explosions, chaos, grenades being thrown, machine guns going off. The shingle on the beach was round rocks like this. A shell would hit that, blow the rock into 1,000 pieces, which became more shrapnel.
Wow.
Whitaker said, I'm going to the casino. Follow me. Whitaker was not someone to say, you boys go attack. He said, follow me. They went. They broke in. Tony Hill was there, another captain. And Whitaker knew his mission was to get into town and create chaos. Whitaker, of course, was a star quarterback for the Hamilton Tigers. QBs know how to run. And he ran. Yeah. And his soldiers went pounding after him. Now, they're in wool battle dress. It's 100 degrees heat, heavy hobnailed boots, carrying 10, 20, 30 pounds of gear. And they ran for the touchdown into town. And they got into an old theater for protection on the Rue de Segogne, the street of Storks. And last night, the night before, was movie night. So this lady is in the theater counting the receipts.
Wow.
And she just looks up, goes back to counting her receipts while the soldiers are firing and pounding through her theater, breaking through. Whitaker realized, and Tony Hill realized, that there was no one coming behind them. And we got to get back, boys. And then on their radio, they got the recall signal that we're going home. And they sent the landing craft in to extract them. So Whitaker had to fight his way back to the casino.
Wow.
And then back down and into the water and onto the boats. When he broke into the casino, and then he went through leading to town, they came under heavy machine gun fire. Into the trench, boys, and they all jumped into this trench. Well, it wasn't a trench, it was a latrine.
No.
So that's how he came back to England, coated in the debris from this latrine,
wow.
minus what was washed off. He got back to England, was given some rum, fell asleep in a storage room until one of his soldiers woke him up and said, "Sir, you got to go to London, there's a big meeting." That's how we went to London with Mountbatten and other generals and colonels in his battle dress, covered in the contents of that latrine, reeking of rum, as the senior surviving officer of the RHLI. He went on, of course, to command the regiment, leading them through some of the most vicious fighting anyone saw in World War II.
Tremendous story. Honorary Captain John Weir Foote. We all know about the John Weir Foote Armories, where the RHLI is stationed. The only chaplain to receive the Victoria Cross. Yes.
He wasn't supposed to be on the raid. He was told to stay back. Every regiment had a practice of LOB, left out of battle. 10% of the regiment stayed back to reconstruct the regiment in case of disaster. And that was very fortuitous in this case. Padre, you're staying there. No, Labatt told him, the CO told him, Labatt of Labatt's Breweries family fame. And he said, no, these are my boys. And he went. And on the beach, he got ashore. He was very burly. He was a big man. And he got onto the beach, and it was just catastrophe, as you know. One of the landing craft got washed ashore and was kind of turned sideways. He began going out into the open. Explosions, machine guns, grenades, all sorts of things going off, chaos, noise, smoke, picking up wounded and bring them to the shelter of this landing craft without any regard, saving dozens of lives. The tide began coming in. He had to move them all into the landing craft, again, under fire, and finally said, Padre, get in the boat. Nope, I'm going with these guys. They're going to need me more. He said, there's lots of chaplains in England. So he voluntarily went into the prisoner of war camp. But for his actions on the beach that day, he was awarded the Victoria Cross. But he didn't know it until after the war, because as a POW, they didn't announce these awards in case the Germans extracted revenge against them or held them for publicity purposes.
Wow.
So the only chaplain to earn the VC.
The probably the most famous battle of all during the Second World War, and you referenced it earlier, is D-Day. Tell us about maybe a favorite story or more memorable story from that invasion.
The Archilai landed a month after D-Day. They were not part of, they were 2nd Division. The Canadians on D-Day were 3rd Division. So the Rileys came ashore after D-Day, got themselves organized, suffered their first continental casualty from some stray artillery rounds the Germans had fired. Now, here's a battalion where most soldiers, again, have not seen combat. They've been heavily trained, but there were very few Dieppe veterans remaining with the battalion. Most of them were dead or POWs. So the remainder became a cadre, and that's when Hamilton the Archilai lost its Hamilton identity. None of or few of the reinforcements were Hamilton Niagara residents, but they very quickly became united in the battalion. And a week after landing, they were told to attack a place called Verrières Ridge. The Germans were holding it very heavily. It was the key to the breakout from the Normandy beachhead. And the Germans didn't want the Allies breaking out. 2 other battalions had gone in to attack this ridge and were decimated. 50% or more casualties, just on the scale of World War I again. And it became the Rileys' turn. And Whitaker, now the CO, was told, you've got to go capture Verrières Ridge. Whitaker used football training a lot. And he said, well, you can try and break through the line or you can do an end run. So he tried a bit of an end run. He did a feint kind of up the middle, but sent other people around the other end, sustaining a lot of casualties on the way. But they broke through the German line and cleared Verrières Ridge and then held it for a week without much support because the clouds came in. Air support was very minimal. At first they had no tanks in support. Finally, some British tanks were able to break through and come in and support them and break up probably 2 or 3 dozen German counterattacks. Until finally the Germans had to say, we can't crack this nut with the Rileys. And they withdrew. The bottleneck was open. The Allies broke through. They raced south, and they had the big battle of the Falaise Gap following that. Coincidentally, just after that, another great Canadian intervention was created. General Simmons, on Operation Totalize, the breakthrough, took the turrets and the guns off some old tanks, mounted his soldiers inside them for protection, and went roaring ahead, inventing the armored personnel carrier, which is used in various forms to this day. So the Rileys were part of that. They broke the bottleneck and opened the way.
Wow. Apart from the massive losses on the battlefields, we heard and learned a little later on in the Second World War the horrors of the concentration camps. Did the Rileys or the Canadian Armed Forces play a big part in discovering any of these camps?
Mostly the British and the Americans were the ones who initially liberated the camps, but the Rileys did liberate one prison camp in the Netherlands. mainly for female Jewish prisoners.
Okay.
And I've spoken to a few who were there at the time of our veterans. They wouldn't talk about it. It was just
It's too hard.
one of the ultimate horrors for them.
Yeah.
They said the ones they did liberate were very, very grateful, physically grateful in many ways. But the pits and the ovens, they never forgot that, and they wouldn't talk much about it.
Yeah.
So that was their sole experience with that, but they knew about it, and some of them experienced it.
How were they when they came home? I mean, they're dealing with this heaviness. They're losing their friends on the battlefield. They're being shot at. They're surviving, in some cases barely. How did they handle it when they got back home?
They handled it as anyone would in many different ways. Some stayed in the military, guys like Jack McFarland, for example, and rose to the rank of regimental sergeant major, served up into the 60s with the Artillery. Others just buried it and got on with their civilian life. Some would join the Legion so they could go and hang out with their buddies where they could feel free to talk. Many of them never dealt with it with their families. A common refrain when I talk to the descendants of these veterans is, I wish I knew. I wish I had talked to my dad about this. And some managed to write down some of their memoirs. A lot of things are being gathered now as families discover old letters sent home. Letters the kids would never have seen, but perhaps a wife or a girlfriend saw, and relate their stories and put them together. And they just got on them. Firefighters, police officers, teachers, steel workers, any conductors on trains, any job you could think of, lumbermen, and they got on with their life. But none of them remained unscarred.
Yeah. How could you? I mean, that was impossible.
You couldn't.
Following the Second World War, we had the Cold War, post-war era, and I'm guessing they were always ready in terms of whether a conflict was going to happen. They were eager to jump in.
Post-war, Canada disarmed itself as fast as it possibly could. It reduced the army to a very small cadre, got rid of most of its weapons. The militia was shrunk. Pay was cut. The regular force battalions were shrunk and reduced. The Air Force disposed of most of its aircraft. The Navy paid off a lot of its ships. We went from the fourth largest Navy to one of the smallest in a year or two. And we were not prepared. And then the Cold War struck, and Canada said, well, okay, we'll do our thing. So we established Air Force and Army bases in Europe. My dad and our family was stationed at Zweibrücken, 3 fighter wing in Germany for 4 years. And the Army was gradually built up. But when Korea broke out, we had nobody to send. We had to recruit volunteers again for Korea. And eventually some regular battalions went as well, but we had to recruit people off the street. The guy who led that first effort was Brigadier John Rockingham, who was a World War II Artillery CO as a lieutenant colonel and later brigadier. So they had to build up a new force to go fight in Korea. Post-war, as part of the Cold War in Europe, the Army decided to take a bunch of reserve regiments and have them raise a company of 120 soldiers who would then go overseas on full-time service to form part of a regular force brigade in Europe. The Rileys ended up sending 2 companies to this force. Eventually, they went over under their own cap badge, the Riley cap badge, but eventually they were amalgamated into one full-time battalion under the Royal Canadian Regiment, and that battalion was then sent to Korea to monitor the peace after the conflict. So Rileys, under another guise, did serve in Korea as well, having come from the front lines of the Cold War, if you will, to the front lines of a hot war, Korea, just after the armistice had been signed. So the Cold War, the politicians, and I come back to this, still not get it. the reserves at home were reduced from a fighting force. The politicians believed that nuclear Armageddon was just over the horizon. Mutual assured destruction, the MAD doctrine. So the militia was taken from war fighting to what we used to call snakes and ladders. They were trained on rescue, rope rescue, and civilian going through bombed out buildings, rescuing people, restoring order and services in that regard. Those were the dark ages. The militia lost its purpose, but a cadre, many of them World War II veterans, did stay on, stayed with it, and eventually the government had to change its policy, readopted the war-fighting nature of the reserves, and we've been slowly building back from that. So we have a saying that we won the war, but now we have to win the peace. And that is an ever-present struggle. We're now aiming to ramp up defense spending to 2% and maybe 5%, and there's no doubt that's going to be a multi-billion-dollar cost over many years, a sustained effort. But we have to grow the strength of the Army. There's no point buying new ships and airplanes and tanks if there's no people to run them.
That's right.
So the key thing is for young people today to see the Army Reserve and the regular Army and Navy and Air Force as a viable career alternative. The pay is excellent. We come back to what you first asked me. The opportunities can be unparalleled. It's an adventure that very few people will ever get to fully appreciate. But if you put yourself into it, the rewards are unparalleled. They're incredible. And it's a very honorable and worthy goal.
Decades after the Korean War, we have the war in Afghanistan, which the RHLI was a part of as well.
The RHLI sent more than 70 people to Afghanistan overall. We were lucky in that we didn't sustain casualties physically. There were some mental casualties, as you can expect. And a good friend of mine went over there, not O'Reilly, and he's gone now. I lost a friend from the Lincoln and Welland Regiment who was killed, Warrant Officer Dennis Brown. But I was fortunate not to lose any dear and personal friends. But as a public affairs officer, I assisted with the funerals of several, and that scars you. When I joined, I didn't expect warfare, to be honest. It was a Cold War. It wasn't a shooting war. And I figured that was the status quo. And then we got into peacekeeping. Friends of mine came under fire peacekeeping. And then the hot war broke out in Afghanistan when NATO and North America were attacked directly. And so we went to war. And the Rileys, the Argyles, other units in Hamilton, the artillery, all stepped up. The citizen soldiers said, I'm signing a contract up to and including my life. And they went to war. Fortunately, most of them came back and are okay.
Is there a tradition that the Rileys have that most people don't know that you would like to share with them?
The Rileys are a light infantry regiment, and the bugle of the light infantry forms part of the Capt badge. Traces back to the German hunting or Jaeger battalions. They adopted the bugle because the drum didn't sound that well in the woods and so on, so the bugle could cut through the battlefield. And that became part of our symbology. But as part of that, the RHLI, on ceremonial occasions, will march at the light infantry pace of 140 steps per minute, because that's what carried them into battle fast. So when they're marching alone and they decide to march at the fast pace, it's a struggle to keep up. But beyond that, they just have the light infantry tradition. The Rileys can point back to 164 years now of history, of success on the battlefield, of always answering the call, always ready. And I think that is the true spirit and tradition of the Rileys.
After all that you've seen and researched and written about and the stories that you've heard and the stories that you've shared, what does Remembrance Day mean to you now?
Well, I remember my lost friends. I remember my World War II friends. As a reporter, many years ago, I interviewed even some World War I veterans who passed on not long after. I wish I'd kept those interviews. But remembrance is not glorification. We have to understand that people die in warfare. Nations put out huge efforts. The home front in Hamilton, the factories working, women into the workforce, replacing the men that went overseas. After World War I, the women kind of retreated back. But after World War II, the women said, I can do this, and I'm going to do this. It revolutionized society. But Remembrance Day can trace its roots back to the Fenian Raids. The Queen's Own in Toronto got tired of not having their sacrifice at Ridgeway remembered. And in 1890, they had put up a monument in Toronto and declared June 2nd to be Decoration Day, when they would go out and decorate the graves of their 9 Ridgeway casualties and gather at the monument and have a parade. The 13th Regiment in Hamilton adopted that practice. We lost 4 dead following the battle of sickness. They were drinking water out of swamps, out of filthy hats, and out of their hands. No food, no water. So they died of fever and other diseases after the battle. And other people began, and then the Boer War came along. We took casualties, and so we had to remember them. So June 2nd was Decoration Day, and the graves of veterans would be decorated. By then, the poppy had become a symbol, so these poppies began popping up, and so on. So Remembrance Day has its roots in the Fenian Raids of 1866 with the 13th Battalion and the Queen's Own. In 1930, the government finally stepped in after World War I and said Armistice Day, November 11th, will be now Remembrance Day nationally. So it became a way for Canadians to pay their respects, not just to the fallen, but to those who still serve today, because they have signed the same contract, up to and including their life. That's unique. Perhaps policing is similar, but where else do you find that? Canadians aren't supposed to die when they go to work. That doesn't account for the military.
Yeah.
So that's what I remember. I do remember the fallen. I do remember the sacrifice. But I remember the willingness of my comrades and myself to do what we would have to do if the time came. And I'm proud. I'm sad at the losses, but I'm proud that people then and today are willing to do what they have to do on behalf of other people. It's not for themselves, it's for other people. Yeah. That's what Remembrance Day is. We have to remember that there are people willing to do that for us.
It is definitely a proud moment for sure. One of 365 days in which we look at our military veterans and those who are still in the ranks and thank them for their service. And I thank you for your service and for your time as well today.
Thank you.
And that is Captain Tim Fletcher, and thank you for checking out the Newsmakers podcast. And a big thank you to the all-star cast behind the scenes. If you like today's episode, click the thumbs up, hit subscribe, leave a comment as well. You can catch the Newsmakers podcast on chch.com/podcasts and wherever you get your favorite podcasts.